You know, we live in extraordinary times. What the world needs, perhaps more now than ever, are men and women who are equipped in the ancient virtue of wisdom. Wisdom is an ability, it's a skill. It's the ability to discern what is true and good and beautiful. So many of the resources that we provide at the Colson Center are designed to help the Christian know what they ought to think about a given issue. But for those that want to go deeper, the Colson Fellows program teaches them how to think.
The Colson Fellows program is a 10-month course in which individuals study what does it mean to live out a Christian worldview in their spheres of influence. A cohort is a group of individuals in a region who are going through the program together. They are led by Commission Colson Fellows, and they meet monthly, typically on a Saturday morning, to engage the material so that you're not just ingesting the material yourself, but you're getting to talk through it with others who are participating with you.
Here you get to see the body of Christ represented in the people that are in the cohort. So we had everything from an individual that was a convicted felon to someone who is a doctor who had at one time performed abortions.
I recommend it. I've been recommending it to everyone I've come in contact with.
It prepared me to be able to go out and engage wherever God calls me to. So no matter what the next season brings, or no matter what my next sphere of influence is, I have coherence within me, and I have a strong understanding of who I am in Christ. And I'm able to bring that into whatever God calls me to.
If anyone would like more information on the Colson Fellows program, all you have to do is scan the QR code on the back of your tag, and it'll take you right to the website. And if you're interested in talking to anybody who's been through the program, anybody who has Colson Fellows at the bottom of their tag, there's about 6 or 7 of us. There comes one walking up the aisle there. There's a few back there. I've been through it. I lead the cohort that meets here as the Philadelphia cohort, and it's an incredible program. I do want to mention also that we have an event once a month on the third Tuesday of the month called Worldview Monthly, where we get together and we talk about things just like we've been talking about today. It's interesting, we see videos and clips of things that we've used on Tuesday nights throughout the last couple of years. And we just discuss, well, how are we supposed to think about these things? So it's an ongoing thing. It's once a month on the third Tuesday, and we meet here at Classroom 1. And next year, we have penciled in Carl Truman, also from Grove City College. So we have Carl Truman penciled in. This is the first time we've actually had somebody already lined up for the next year, so it's kind of neat to be able to announce that a year ahead of time. And, by the way, I guess I should clear up the way I came up and kind of joked around about not being in the session and setting up a kissing booth and then asking where my wife was. That sounded like I actually wanted to know where my wife was. I was joking around about the kissing booth, just to be clear. I didn't want to start a kissing booth with her. Well, I would, but yeah, you know what I mean. Okay, so, yeah. Anyway, so would anybody like the newer Elisa Childers book? Oh, right there. I saw that hand go up. There we go. Duffy, you're up.
Okay, here we go. Thank you so much for your patience and forbearance. Let's jump into our third session of this morning. Dave, yeah. Oh, okay.
I just had a few people come up to me and say, tell him to stop saying he's worried about time and all this. He said, tell him to take his time. So we may go past 12 o'clock. Is that okay if we go about 12:15? So, okay, so there you go. There's your grace.
Okay.
Again.
Yeah, all right. Would somebody sort of be in charge of Dave, just kind of keep him down there? So, yeah, I don't know if any of you are fans of riddles or not. If we have any people who really like riddles, I'm just going to give you one of my favorite ones. And if you know this riddle, don't yell it out or anything. The riddle is: you enter a room, Romeo and Juliet lie dead on the floor, broken glass and water surround them. A cat peeks out from behind the curtain. How did they die? If you know the riddle, you know the answer, just sit there smugly and think of yourself as superior to these other fools. But if you've never heard it before, we have a riddle. Which one did I spell wrong? Peaks. Okay. No, this cat actually climbs up. Yeah, it's amazing. Ed, keep those thoughts to yourself. What is it about this group right here that makes you want to interrupt? If it appears, Ed, that I'm open to discussion from the audience, I'm not. Okay, Okay, somebody other than Ed who doesn't have a hypercritical spirit. No, thank you, Ed. I'm going to make sure I change that when I get back to the room. Okay, somebody, anybody think you've never heard this before? Anybody have an answer? How? You're in our room, Romeo and Juliet lie dead on the floor, broken glass and water surround them. A cat peeks out, literally climbs up to the top of the curtain, peeks out from behind the curtain. How did they die? Yes, ma'am. Say it again. You got to yell it out. Poison. They were poisoned. Yeah, they were poisoned. Very, very sinister. Okay. Somebody else? Anybody else? That's a good guess. Not the correct answer to the riddle. Yeah. Yes. Romeo and Juliet. That's the answer. Romeo and Juliet are actually goldfish. They're goldfish. And so that's exactly what happens. Romeo and Juliet, they're a goldfish in the bowl. The cat, actually having climbed up the curtain, now sees that they're swimming in the bowl. He knocks it over, and there's broken glass and water everywhere. Now, here's the point. Why is that riddle difficult? Why is that riddle a riddle? It's a riddle because every one of us, when we hear the names Romeo and Juliet, we immediately default to a story written by William Shakespeare of these two star-crossed lovers, right? And so in other words, when we hear this little story on the screen, it confuses us as we try to interpret what it means. It confuses us in what we see because we already bring a story to that story. What we're going to do in this session is think about a very simple principle. What are the stories that make the biblical story confusing? What are the stories that people already have? One thing we know is that every story we see and hear is shaped by every story we've seen and heard. Which means when some people hear a biblical story, even if we think we've done our very best to make it clear and plain and compelling, that there are other stories that they have heard that somehow muddle everything. They just make it a riddle, an undecipherable riddle. And so that's why in this last session, we want to take a short tour of some of the big ideas, some of the big stories that shape how people hear the biblical story. That's our agenda. Let's jump into this, and I promise we'll be out of here by 3. So the very first big idea, though, I'm going to talk about 3 big ideas this morning. The first one is paganism. No such thing as truth. The second big story is pluralism. No such thing as false. And the third big story is postmodernism. No such thing as certainty. No such thing as certainty. Let's begin with that first big story. No such thing as truth, which is paganism. If we really want to understand some of the confusion, some of the stories, the big stories that make it hard for people to understand a biblical story, we have to understand, first of all, this idea of paganism, that there's no such thing as truth. Now, a lot of us, when we think of paganism, I don't know about you, but I think a lot of us, we think about people in distant nations who worship primitive deities in faraway lands. And that's mostly what we think about when we think of paganism. But actually, if you go to the dictionary, paganism is, according to Webster, a pagan is one who has little or no religion and delights in sensual pleasures and material goods. That's the definition of a pagan. A pagan is one who has little or no religion and delights in sensual pleasures and material goods. Now, here's the question. Do we need to go to another country to find a pagan? No, we probably don't have to leave this room. right? I mean, this is the story in which we are all living. This is the story of paganism. Another word for paganism is the word secularism. Secularism. Secularism is a worldview, a big story, which assumes that this world, the material world, is all that there is. That that's all that can be accessed. That which you can see, taste, touch, hear, and smell, that's paganism or secularism. One writer, Os Guinness, puts it like this: it's the process by which religious ideas, institutions, and interpretations lose their significance. So according to this story, then, a biblical story is really out of bounds. It's not that you can't believe it. It's just that it does not belong in the public square. It's not something that's going to in any way generate ideas or policies or thoughts or certain political engagement, because that's just a little idea over there off to the side. In fact, Peter Berger, a sociologist, describes paganism or secularism this way. He says, paganism is the process by which sectors of society and culture are removed from the domination of religious institutions and symbols. It's basically this idea that it's okay for you to believe that story, but that's a story, and there's a much bigger story, and then the bigger story, any story about God, any story about some sort of cosmic big, creator, that story isn't really legit. And so to really understand why or how we might communicate this biblical story to that group, that culture, we have to understand they're beginning with a premise that there is no such thing as truth. There's no such thing as truth. It was Aristotle who said that anytime we gain knowledge, we basically gain knowledge so we can learn truth. The reason we learn truth is because on the basis of truth, we will found our morality. We will found our morality. We'll anchor our morality in truth. And then, having decided what is moral behavior, how best to live on the basis of truth, then we will develop our technologies, our technique. So if morality is living better lives, technology is how to live lives better. Morality is more sort of what we are to believe. Technology tells us how to live our lives. Now, here's the problem in a culture of paganism. In a culture of paganism, you lose that foundational piece. You lose that truth. And when you lose that truth, you're at a place where there's really no longer a foundation. My wife, several years ago, she wanted us to wallpaper the kitchen. And I am not good at stuff around the house. I'm just not. I don't have that gene. My dad had it. My brother has it. I don't. My idea of handiwork is handing someone money to do the work, and I just can't do it. But I did say, I said, finally, after a lot of conversation, I go, look, how hard can it be to paste paper to a wall? And yeah, please don't get ahead of me. And anyway, so I said, okay, all right. So I go to Home Depot, I get all the stuff and everything, come home, and we're gonna begin to wallpaper this kitchen. And on the very first page, almost the very first page, if not the second page, the Time Life Wallpaper Guide, it tells you that you must begin with something called a plumb line. A plumb line. Now, most of you know probably what a plumb line is. I can see it because you're sitting there smug and arrogant. But I didn't. I didn't know what it was. I'll just admit it right up front. And so I read in the Time Life book what it is where you take a tack and you tack a piece of string to the very top where the wall meets the ceiling, and then weight it on the bottom so that it hangs straight down. And then you chalk that string, pull the string tight, so that when you pop it up against the wall, it gives you a true up and down line so that you can line up properly that first panel of wallpaper. And I understood the concept, but we could not find any string. We looked in all the junk drawers. We could not find any string. I tried an extension cord, and that, if you're just going to ridicule me, I'm not going to tell the story. And we tried, extension cord. That didn't work. I finally said to her, I said, you know what? This is not the East Room of the White House. I said, let's just cite it. And she said, okay. Kind of the way I think maybe Custer's men said right before the charge. And I said, let's just say, she goes, okay. I said, well, you come over and take a look. And so I get it up there and I got it on the wall. She says, that's good. I said, yeah, okay, let me look quick. And she got, the first panel looked awesome. I still, to this day, say if we had stopped with that one panel, we probably would have been fine. She thought that would look a little obtuse. So we kept on going and got the second wall. Things are looking pretty good. It's all flat and smooth. I'm feeling good about things. And we get the third wall. We're good until we got to the corner. And that's when she started asking me annoying questions. Like, if it's straight up and down, why does it overlap the corner? I had to explain to her, this is an older house, and homes will routinely sink in one area. I said, that's why God made razor blades. And so I fixed that, and everything was okay, but by the time we got back to the first panel again, it was undeniable. Something was wrong. We were booing one another's spirits by saying things like, no, I like it. It has movement. People walk into our kitchen now and they go, well, like what you've done to this room. Hey, do you have any Dramamine? I mean, basically, that project was flawed from the very beginning because we lacked a plumb line. We are living in a culture, men and women, that lacks a plumb line. It's just like in the book of Judges when the scripture says there was no king in Israel and everybody does what's right in their own eyes. That is paganism. There is no such thing as truth. And the problem is when you do away with a foundational truth, it's impossible to have any kind of set morality of right and wrong. Let's watch. Now, remember this guy from the first session? You remember how he finally concludes? He says, I personally believe that whatever you believe is right or wrong, that should apply. And we made the point then that I want to affirm now that it's almost impossible to really say anything is evil or anything is bad if there's no such thing as good, no such thing as true. You really left in a culture where pretty much anything goes. It's interesting, Christian Smith is a sociologist. He teaches up at University of Notre Dame now. But in his book about millennials, he wrote, called Lost in Transition, he wrote, it's not so much that these young Americans are living lives of sin and debauchery, at least no more than you'd expect from 18 to 23-year-olds. What's disheartening is how bad they are at thinking and talking about moral issues. The interviewers asked open-ended questions about right and wrong, moral dilemmas, and the meaning of life. In the rambling answers which Smith and company recount in their book, Lost in Transition, you see the young people groping to say anything sensible on these matters, but they just don't have the categories or the vocabulary to do so. And asked to describe a moral dilemma they had faced, 2/3 of the young people either couldn't answer the question or describe the problems that are not moral at all, like whether they could afford to rent a certain apartment or whether they had enough quarters to feed the meter at a parking spot. They simply didn't have the categories because they had no foundational moral truth. This is exactly what Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, said. He said, without God and the future life, in other words, without that foundation, everything is permitted. One can do anything because you're really at a place where there's nothing left, no truth, no morality, all you have is technique. And of course, in our culture, what is it that we celebrate above all? It's technology. It's technology. We're no longer asking the question, should this be done? We're simply asking the question, can this be done? That's precisely what you'd expect in a pagan culture. Charles Taylor, who wrote the book on secularism, really a brilliant work, puts it like this. He said, our modern secular morality is self-authorizing. In other words, truth is what I say it is. Truth is what I say it is. In a more extended explanation, he puts it like this. I think this puts it well. Once human beings took away their norms, their goods, their standards of ultimate value, that foundational truth, from an authority outside of themselves, from God or the gods or the nature of being or the cosmos, but then they came to see that these higher authorities were their own fictions, and they realized they had to establish their norms and values for themselves on their own authority. They dictate the ultimate values by which they live. One of the kind of trends that you've seen over the last 30 to 40 years in modern education is that we really don't want to teach people what to think. We really want to teach them how to think. And you notice in that stage there's an emphasis there no longer on truth but on technique. We're teaching people how to think. I actually heard a principal at a Florida high school say, I'm really not interested in our students learning geography. I'm really interested in helping them learn how to read a map. In other words, I'm interested in helping them learn cartography. And that's an interesting statement for an educator, because here's the problem. If you look at this map, you can be you can be a premier cartographer and look at this map and be completely lost if you are not well versed in certain geographical truth. In other words, you might be able to, I see an interstate, or I see, looks like some mountains, or I see a lake, or you might be a great cartographer. But if you don't have some facts about the state of Montana, you're going to completely be lost. It's not enough to have technique. There has to be some knowledge. There has to be some truth. And of course, in our culture, it's not just a matter of lacking any kind of truth. It's that truth has now become whatever you say it is. That south is north, and north is south, and east is west, and so it's sort of your ball game. One of the main ways this plays out is it really leaves us without any kind of reasonable way to ask moral questions. Like I remember when I was in school, there was a poster on the wall, and it basically makes this statement. It says, "Give a man a fish, and he'll eat for a day." Do you remember this? Give a man a fish, he'll eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, and what? He'll eat for a lifetime. Now, it's interesting, when you think about that poster, what it's really doing is it's juxtaposing two different techniques. One technique of giving a man a fish of helping a guy eat is to give him a fish. He can eat for that day. The second technique is to teach a guy to fish, and he eat for a lifetime. So basically what you've got is two techniques posed against each other. The missing question, of course, is the moral question. And the moral question is the question for which we have no foundation, and that is, what do I care whether the guy eats? Let him starve. Why should I care whether he gets fish? In other words, at the end of the day, why do I care whether the man eats or not? You really haven't given me any foundational reason to believe that. Just to give you another sort of maybe even more relevant example or more recent example, you'll notice nowadays, for example, in sexual education, there's no discussion whatsoever about should we have sex before marriage. All the questions are reduced to this: how do we have safe sex? In other words, it's not a moral question, it's a technique question. It's a technique question, because there really isn't any foundation upon which to decide how does one make these choices. Because in a paganistic culture, there's no such thing as truth. Now, if paganism is no such thing as truth, that leads us to a second problem, and that is, if there's no such thing as truth, there's no such thing as false. There's no such thing as false. How often have you heard phrases like this? It's not right for us to force our morality on someone else. Who are we to say that someone else is doing something sinful? Why don't we don't have the right to judge each other. It's not for me to say that somebody else is involved in sin. We need to be careful about being judgmental. I don't think we have the right to condemn other people. The Bible says not to judge. It's not right for us to say someone else is wrong. Christians get a bad name because they lack tolerance. We need to be tolerant of people who don't share the same values we do. None of us really has the right to question someone else's moral choices. It's a personal decision. What would Oprah do? I mean, basically, these are phrases that you kind of hear in everyday parlance, in everyday conversation. And these questions, all of them really are born out of a notion that if there's no such thing as truth, it's only arrogance and intolerance and rudeness that would lead someone to say that anybody is false. Let's watch. Oh, now it's pretty clear here that that the mindset, the story that has informed these young people is that there's no such thing as truth. And it's only rational if that's the story in which you live, that's the story you inhabit. It's only rational to say, therefore, there's no such thing as false. That's why you hear things like, well, there are many, many different ways to God, or there are many, many different ideas. Many, of course, refers to the word plural, or many, or more than one, pluralism. And this, of course, is something that has been enshrined in our legal system in the last several years, especially since back in the early 90s when U.S. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, in the Casey Planned Parenthood case, rendered this decision. He said, at the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. In other words, it's your right. Your right. There's no such thing as truth. You get to define the universe, the meaning of the universe for yourself. Under those terms, there are many, many different ways of approaching truth. That's pluralism. There was a book that came out probably back in the late 90s. It was written by a guy named Alan Wolfe. I don't recommend it at all, but it's a book called One Nation After All. One Nation After All. What was interesting about the book was that in this book, Alan Wolfe actually interviewed families, middle-class families, you can see on the front cover there, to kind of get their opinion about everyday issues and everyday topics. And what I found especially intriguing in this book was that one of the interviewees was a woman named Barbara Tompkins. Barbara Tompkins. And what was intriguing to me about Barbara Tompkins, she was from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and she was the daughter of a Southern Baptist pastor. And so one might expect that if you're the daughter of a Southern Baptist pastor, of all people, you would have some foundation, some sort of doctrinal foundation from your childhood. But listen to her answer when she talks about another interviewee who in his interview answered that homosexual sin was sinful, or homosexual behavior was sinful. Barbara Tompkins, and this is not a picture of Barbara Tompkins, this is what I imagine she looked like, but basically Barbara Tompkins says is he cannot make a broad statement that that's wrong. Why is it wrong for them? I mean, do we all have to have the same color hair? She goes on to explain, I think everyone inside has their own persona of God. You don't have to accept anybody's dogma whole. Live with the concept of God as you perceive it. As you perceive it. You can hear there the sort of the pluralism inherent in her idea that hey, wait a minute, who is to say that somebody else's idea is wrong? If there's no such thing as truth, then it's not right. It's kind of rude. It's a little bit arrogant to say somebody is wrong. Now, let me just pause here a minute and say that, first of all, pluralism is not a dirty word. Pluralism can be a good thing. In fact, it's an essential part of a true democracy. We have to give people the right, the freedom to think what they wish to think. In his book, The Making of the Christian Mind, Arthur Holmes puts it well. He says, pluralism can be extremely beneficial. Its very presence offsets lopsided emphases. It counters premature dogmatism. It encourages self-criticism. It aids the improvement of understanding and provides alternate avenues to explore. It reminds us of our finiteness. All of us are human beings. All of us are limited by our knowledge. All of us are sinful people. None of us sees the full picture. And that's why we need to be pluralistic to this extent. It does help us. It reminds us of our finiteness, our creatureliness, our humanity. Without that awareness, a worldview could not be Christian at all. But here's where pluralism goes wrong. It begins with a basic idea. It basically says this: if all truth is created by humans, in other words, man is the measure of all truth. There's no foundation. Truth is kind of, what you get to define your meaning of the universe according to the Supreme Court. And all humans are created equal. Then doesn't it make sense to say that all viewpoints are equally true? Like, all of us are created equal, and we all equally have the right to kind of create our own sense of the meaning of the world and what truth is. Then doesn't it make sense that all viewpoints are equally true? Here's the problem with that, and I think G.K. Chesterton summed it up well. He said, when you turn from the one true God, you don't turn to no God. You turn to all gods. You turn to all gods. Because let's go back to this statement. First of all ideas are not equally valid. And even the most devout pluralist understands this. All ideas are not equally valid. Even our friend Barbara Tompkins, you notice how she begins her critique of her neighbor? She says, he cannot make a broad statement that that's wrong. Why, Barbara? And she goes, because that's wrong. On what basis? What is the foundation? If we all get to form our own meaning of the universe, there really is no foundation of saying that anything is wrong. It is true. All people are created in the image of God. All people. And frankly, during an election year, this is no small thing to remember. All people are created in the image of God and are to be equally respected. But not all ideas imagined by every human is equally respectable. And even postmodernists don't really believe this. In fact, what you discover about people who are pluralistic, they are very, very pluralistic unless you disagree with them. They are very pluralistic unless you agree with them. They can be very dogmatic and narrow-minded if you do. We've all heard stories in the last few years about particular people, J.K. Rowling in this case, who actually said that there was such a thing as male and female. Well, all of a sudden, her right to create the meaning and the reality of her universe is just subjected to the judgment of her publisher or to other people saying, no, she doesn't have the right to say that. And so we're going to cancel her. Rowling writes, I observe that there's no constructive endgame to critical theory. In fact, one might quip that the game is the end. The constant destabilizing of any claims to power or truth is the purpose. And if you have an unconditional or uncritical commitment to critical theory, you must realize that you have a tiger by the tail. In other words, you're going to argue argument itself away. If at any moment you want to let go of the project merely because it has destabilized your particular target, you'll find that you and yours are soon to be devoured by it. And there are numerous stories like this. Ryan Anderson, when he wrote his book on transgenderism, his book was taken off of Amazon. They canceled him. because they said, no, you're writing hateful speech. You don't agree with it. You don't agree with us. And that's the problem with pluralists, is they really realize at the end of the day, whether they admit it or not, they do have a foundational belief. Even the great philosopher and thought leader, Oprah Winfrey, puts it like this: one of the biggest mistakes we make is to believe that there's only one way. There are many diverse paths to God. Now, it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, Oprah, why is that a mistake? What authoritative truth, on what basis, on what authoritative truth are you basing that critique? Why are we supposed to believe you? Like, where does your foundational truth come from? And again, this is precisely the problem that we're seeing in American culture, is we're a culture of pluralists. Again, going back to the research by Christian Smith, Tim Keller talks about that in his book. He says, American adults held two views of morality in sharp tension, even contradiction. Most are relativistic, not believing in abiding moral absolutes. We talked about that already. Smith's findings are that about 30% of younger adults are very strong relativists. Most say they believe in morality, but they define it as behavior that makes people thrive and be happy. And yet they have very many strong moral convictions which they insist others should honor. When asked how they know if an action was moral or not, most just said that they automatically know what's right and wrong in any situation. When asked how they would explain to someone else why they should do or not do some action, they repeatedly insisted that everybody already knows what's right and wrong. But there is no set of moral values that is self-evident to all people. Again, this leaves modern secular people in the position of insisting that other people's morals are constructed, in other words, kind of made up their own thing, they constructed it, their own little story, yet acting toward others as if theirs are not. That's pluralism. Pluralism is basically a mindset that there's no such thing as false. I really don't know anybody who's better captured the spirit and the problem of pluralism than, oddly enough, the comedian Taylor Molley. He has a little clip that I want to show you. It's about 2 minutes long, 3 minutes long, but it really captures, I think, the problem of pluralism. It leaves us with the inability of saying anything with authority. Let's watch.
To the ends of our sentences, even when those sentences aren't like questions. Declarative sentences, so called because they used to, like, declare things to be true, okay? As opposed to other things that are like totally, not. They've been infected by this tragically cool and totally hip interrogative tone. As if I'm saying, don't think I'm a nerd just because I've, noticed this, okay? I have nothing personally invested in my own opinions. I'm just, inviting you to join me on the bandwagon of my own uncertainty. What has happened to our conviction? Where are the limbs out on which we once walked? Have they been, chopped down with the rest of the rainforest? Or do we have, nothing to say? Has society just become so filled with these conflicting feelings of that we've just gotten to the point where we're the most aggressively inarticulate generation to come along since, a long time ago? So I implore you, I entreat you, and I challenge you to speak with conviction, to say what you believe in a manner that bespeaks the determination with which you believe it. Because contrary to the wisdom of the bumper sticker, it is not enough these days to simply question authority. You gotta speak with it, too.
Now, of course, it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to ask Taylor Molly on what basis, on what authority does one speak? Like, again, it just leaves us right back in the same problem. If there's no foundation for truth, there's no such thing as truth, it's impossible to say there's any such thing as false. But I think he's done a pretty good job of kind of capturing this kind of collective sense of we don't really want to say anything assertive that's true, because that just kind of makes us sound arrogant and all-knowing. So we have two big ideas so far: paganism, no such thing as truth; pluralism, no such thing as false. Let's take our last few minutes to look at one more: no such thing as certainty, postmodernism. No such thing as certainty. Some of you may be familiar with this poem. It's a poem that came out years ago. It's called The 6 Men of Indostan. The 6 Men of Indostan. And I can't help it. I have to always apologize to my students at Grove City College. When I read this poem, I automatically divert to an English accent. So the 6 Men of Indostan. It was 6 men of Indostan, to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against his broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, "God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall." The second, feeling of the tusk, cried, "Ho, what have we here, so very round and smooth and sharp? To me 'tis mighty clear, this wonder of an elephant is very like a spear." The third approached the animal, and happening to take the squirming trunk within his hands, thus boldly up and spake, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a snake." The fourth reached out his eager hand, and felt about the knee. "What both this wondrous beast is like is mighty plain," quoth he, "'tis clear enough, the elephant is very like a tree." The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, said, "Even the blindest man can tell what this resembles most, deny the fact who can, this marvel of an elephant is very like a fan." The sixth no sooner had begun about the beast to grope, than seizing on the swinging tail that fell within his scope, "I see," quoth he, "the elephant is very like a rope." And so these men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion, exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong. Part of the point of this particular psalm, thank you for the one person who applauded. Thank you for that applaud. But anyway, at the point of this little poem, I think it's really quite brilliant, is to say that, you know what, all of us are blind. We're all blind in different ways. But because of all of us are blind, who is to say, I know exactly what an elephant looks like? Who really knows the truth about the elephant? And it takes us back to this proverb, in a sense, with which we began this session. Every story we hear and see is shaped by every story we've seen and heard. In a sense, your experience of reality, your experience of every single event, even the words that we hear, is shaped by the experiences and the words and the feelings that we bring to it. It's shaped by our childhood. It's shaped by our culture. It's shaped by our background. In that sense, all of us are blind. And therefore, who of us can claim to see with absolute clarity? Who of us can claim to say we know the absolute truth? It's probably put best by Leonard Sweet, who said, none of us can claim immaculate perception. All of us are blind. And if all of us are blind, then who can say anything with absolute certainty? This is the question posed by the postmodernist. All of us would agree that we're limited. All of us would agree to our finiteness. All of us would agree that we're blinded, but we're all blinded in different ways. So who's to say with authority and certainty any statement whatsoever? That's postmodernism. Another way to sort of think about it is the way posed by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis writes a little passage about where he's working out in his garden there at the kiln, and he went into the shed because he had to get a hoe. And I have to explain to my students that a hoe is a garden tool. But he went into the shed to get a hoe, and he goes in there, and while he's standing in the shed, the door slams shut. So now he's standing there in the darkness, except there is a beam of sunlight coming through the crack at the top of the door. And this is where the passage begins. The sun was shining outside, and through the crack at the top of the door, there came a sunbeam. From where I stood, that beam of light with the specks of dust floating in it. You ever seen that? You know what he's talking about, right? You kind of see these little flecks of dust, and it occurs to you, I am breathing that in. And with the specks of dust floating in it was the most striking thing in the place. Everything else was almost pitch black. I was seeing the beam, not seeing things by it. The sun was shining outside, and through the crack at the top of the door, there came a sunbeam. From where I stood, that beam of light with the specks of dust floating, it was the most striking thing in the place. Everything else was almost pitch black. I was seeing the beam, not seeing things by it. Now that's critical, that little phrase. But then he takes a step. So he's now, instead of looking at the beam like this, he takes a step like this. So that now he's looking along the beam through the crack at the top of the door. Then I moved so that whole beam fell on my eyes. Instantly, the whole previous picture vanished. I saw no tool shed, and above all, no beam. Instead, I saw, framed in the irregular cranny at the top of the door, green leaves moving on the branches of a tree outside, and beyond that, 90-odd million miles away, the sun. And then he makes this statement, and it's a very important statement. Looking along the beam and looking at the beam are very different experiences. But this is only a very simple example of the difference between looking at and looking along. And what he's trying to do here is draw a distinction between two ways of knowing reality, two ways of encountering reality. One is to look at it, and the other is to look along it. So looking at the beam, that would be the way of encountering reality that is suggested to us by what is known as modernism. Modernism. It is looking at. The second way of knowing reality is the way of knowing reality where you actually stand like this and you look along the beam for yourself. And what he's explaining is, obviously, depending on whether you look at or look along, you get two very different experiences of what reality is. And I would even add this, that actually, depending on how tall you are, when you look along the beam, you're going to see something very different right through the crack at the top of the door. So if you're my height, you see the sun. If you're, maybe Dave's height, if you're really, really tall, you don't see the sun at all. You see trees out there. So there's a lot of subjectivism in looking along. It's very much a matter of your own individual height. C.S. Lewis wants us to understand this difference between looking at and looking along. So he gives us a second example. Here's a second example. A young man meets a girl. The whole world looks different when he meets her. Her voice reminds me of something he's been trying to remember all his life. And 10 minutes casual chat with her is more precious than all the favors that all other women in the world can grant. Aww. He is, as they say, in love. Now comes a scientist and describes this young man's genes and a recognized biological stimulus. This is the difference between looking along and looking at. Now, when I ask my college students, I say, okay, who do you trust if the guy says he's in love? Do you trust him, or do you trust the scientist who says, no, I've hooked him up to electrodes, I've checked his pulse, I've looked for all kinds of biological stuff. Trust me, this guy's not in love. And the guy says, I am in love. You're not in love. Which one do you trust? Do you trust the kid? And most of the hands go up. Do you trust the scientist? Not too many. I said, well, that's funny, because how many of you have ever been a fool for love? Again, most hands go up. So why in the world would you trust the kid? The scientist is the one who's objective. We know he's objective because what's he wearing? A white coat. And that's all plain and sterile and objective looking. And so why don't we trust the kid? They say because you don't know about love unless you look along it. You have to experience it. You can't know it by just looking at it. Okay, I'll grant that, but here's the problem. If that's the way to know reality, wouldn't you agree that is extremely, extremely subjective, depending on your experiences of love, experiencing on your background, your history, your culture, the experience of how your culture thinks about men and women and marriage and love and so forth. So really, if that's the way you're going to know reality, that is a way that allows you very, very little certainty. And that's the dilemma of postmodernism. It sort of leaves us in this place where we don't really know. C.S. Lewis goes on to say, and I've added in some wording here, but he says, as soon as you have grasped the simple distinction between looking at and looking along, it raises a question. You get one experience of a thing when you look along it, that's postmodernism, and another when you look at it, that's modernism. Which is the true or the valid experience? And if you limit yourself to simply knowing reality, knowing truth through looking at, which tends to be more objective, more cut and dried, you'd have to agree that you're leaving a whole realm of reality to the unknown and unknowable. But on the other hand, if you embrace that reality of looking along, it's extremely subjective. Even how tall you are could make a difference what you see through the top of the door. And it's this postmodernist thinking, for example, that back in 1970, back in the early 1900s, Marcel Duchamp, some of you remember this name, submitted to an art show in Paris this as a work of art. It's called Fountain. He called it Fountain. And the jury said, no, you can't submit that as a work of art. He said it is art. They said it's not art. Now, Duchamp was looking along. He says, art is what I say it is. They were looking at and saying it's not art. And obviously, in their mind, they had some foundational truth by which to make that judgment. Well, I show my students this same picture, and I ask them, how many of you think this is art? There are a few hands. How many think it's not art? More hands. I say, okay, what about this question? Is this art? What makes that art? Or what about this? Is this art? Is this art? What about this? I start to see more hands. Oh yeah, this is art. What about that? Holy cow. Oh my gosh, yes, I wish I had that. What about this? Yeah, I mean, Western Pennsylvania, people want to shoot these. Okay, what about that? Is that art? Yeah, what about that? Oh, that's scary. What about this? Is that art? No, that's not art. How do you know what's art? And people go, well, I mean, I have this. Well, give me your foundation. What is the criteria of absolute certainty you can define what art is? And here's the problem. If we can't have an absolute criteria for what art is, how can we have an absolute criteria for what a male is? Or what a female is? Or how can we have an absolute criteria for what's right and what's wrong? That you're really left in a place where there's really no such thing as certainty. You're left in a place where you say, well, wait a minute. One thing I know, okay, maybe, I agree that there's a whole lot of subjectivity over here in the kid that says he's in love. But one thing I know is you cannot know about love all there is to know just by some guy who's running scientific tests. There's more to love than that. And that's what the postmodernist says. The postmodernist basically says, if it doesn't mean anything else, if you want to know reality, you have to go post or beyond modernism. You have to go beyond looking at. In other words, to put it in a form of a diagram, we used to say, okay, back in the 60s and the 50s, and this really started actually in the Enlightenment. But we used to say, okay, there's a truth out there. There's a truth. Everybody knows the truth. And so once you discover that truth, that's going to impact your relationships and your feelings and your experiences. The postmodernist says, no, you've got it exactly backwards. because we're all blind in different ways. Really what it is your relationships and your feelings and your experiences, that's what actually determines your understanding of truth. And because we all have different feelings, because we all have different experiences, we're all blind in different ways. How can we say anything with absolute certainty? How can we make the claim that we absolutely know? That's postmodernism. That's the question it poses. Let me try very quickly, because I know we have this youth pastor luncheon in 9 minutes. Let me try very quickly to give you two factors that I think are important to understand with postmodernism. And I'm going to cut immediately to the flaws. First of all, I will say this. Because in Christian culture, especially I think in evangelical Christian, we think of postmodernism as the boogeyman, that it's all bad. But I want to remind you, for example, what the psalmist writes when he says, taste and see that the Lord is good. He's basically saying, look along, experience God's goodness. You will see it, you will feel it, you will experience it for yourself. But the problem is, of course, it's very, very subjective. Ask ye. Because things didn't turn out in his career the way he thought it was. So that's what bothers us. We don't want to just leave it to the subjective side, but you cannot fully dismiss that side. There's nothing more subjective than something like taste. I mean, the psalmist doesn't say, learn systematic theology and see how the Lord is good. How blessed is the man who reads Calvin's Institutes. It's taste and see. Taste and see. So it's not as if postmodernism is all bad. In fact, what the writer of Hebrews says is, guess what? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Of things not seen. But there are two big problems with postmodernism. And I would suggest, if you want to read more about this, one of the best, I think, simple surveys is Millard Erickson's book, The Postmodernizing the Faith. But let me try to summarize two. The first one is this, is that basically postmodernism leaves us in a disintegrated world. It leaves us in a disintegrated world. What do we mean by this? Well, here's the problem, is if we say everybody is blind, therefore nobody knows what an elephant is, we're left in a world where the word elephant no longer has meaning. We're left in a world where we can no longer use the word elephant. If we really believe that everything and anything is art, then we're left in a world where there's no such thing as art. Anything can be art. Francis Schaeffer makes this point in his book that came out back in the 80s called How Should We Then Live? It was followed up with a film series. And he talks about how music, if anything in postmodernity is defined as music, it could be anything you want it to be. And I remember, I was a teenager in the late 60s. I remember there was a postmodern band called the Mothers of Invention. And in fact, I think Dave has it on the playlist this morning. But Mothers of Invention, this is one of the songs. This is from their live concert. This is music. Watch. We'll get to the chorus later, but the problem is, because that's not music. Well, again, that's the problem with postmodernism. It leaves us no way, no boundaries. Anything is music. Or, for that matter, violence. There's no limit to who could say what's the foundation for violence. Racism, there's no really foundation for anything about anything. All words tend to lose their meaning. That's what we mean by disintegration. In fact, John Cage, one of the postmodern musicians, you probably know this, and Schaeffer talks about it in his book and film series. John Cage recorded 18 minutes of silence. And he would frequently perform that. I have a video, I'm not going to take time to show it, of him performing. It's a little slow in places, but he has an actual video of him performing this on the street in San Francisco, and he just closes the piano and sits for 18 minutes. There's a stopwatch on the keyboard. Sits for 18 minutes, that's music. But again, the problem is if that's music, then nothing is music, or everything is music. And this, of course, is the confusion of postmodernism, is it disintegrates. I was telling my students what's interesting about that. There was a British band, I showed them the article. There was a British band that actually had some space left on their CD, and so they recorded, in homage to John Cage, a section they called Silence. John Cage sued them for copyright infringement. But that's the kind of world that postmodern leaves us in. It sort of leaves us in this place where really nothing makes sense. In an effort to see truth, we don't see anything. I think C.S. Lewis sums this up well. He says, you cannot go on explaining away forever. You will find that you've explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the whole window should be transparent because the street or garden beyond it is opaque. But what if you saw through the garden too? It is no use trying to see through first principles. If you see through everything, then everything is transparent. But a wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see. I like the way one writer put it. One writer put it like this, you know what? John Gage, when he gets to a stoplight, I mean, he's dead now, but when he got to a stoplight, he wasn't postmodern about it. He said, that light is red. I'm going to stop. He didn't say red as a matter of taste. In fact, interesting, Schaeffer brings his point up. He was a collector of mushrooms. And he actually says himself, I realized if my approach to mushrooms was the same as my postmodern approach to everything else, I would die. You can't live that way. That's what he means by disintegration. And then the last comment is this, that postmodernism does not fit the real world. It simply does not fit the real world. I remember walking through, when I taught at Eastern, I remember seeing on the bulletin board one day this poster. It says postmodern. And it shows a picture of the Sydney Harbor Bridge, which, you know, if you're a college student, you're supposed to look at that and go, dude. You know, that just like, that is so cool. But I've been to Australia a bunch of times, and I can tell you, nobody would cross the Sydney Harbor Bridge if it really looked like that. You wouldn't, because even postmodernists realize there is such a thing as gravity. It's not a matter of opinion. And so even though it's supposed to be cool to say it's postmodern, that doesn't fit the world that is. That's precisely the point of that Prager video we saw early this morning. That when you live in a postmodern world, all of a sudden now you've lost the boundary of maleness and femaleness. So you have males competing in a female sporting event. In fact, one photographer complained because he had taken a picture of Leah Thomas, who was the guy that had transitioned into a female swimmer. And he complained because when they published the picture had been edited to make Leah Thomas look more like a woman. Now, why did they have to edit the picture to make him look more like a woman? Because he was a man. They wanted to make it fit this imaginary world instead of the real world. One writer puts it like this, okay, when it comes to postmodernism, you might win the argument, but at the end of the day, I win you. Because you have to live as if there is a reality. In fact, it's a little bit telling, isn't it? At the very end of that poem about the 6 men of Indostand, I want you to notice the last 2 lines. Though each was partly in the right, all were in the wrong. In other words, the writer of the poem admits there really is such a thing as an elephant. And no matter what your particular blindness says, this is how elephants really look. There is a foundational truth. And so at the end of the day, we have to come back to a foundation truth. We have to figure out what is that foundation, and that's where we come back. That's where we come back to this notion that I've got to balance my experience with the truth. Jesus, I think, puts it best, and I'll stop here. Jesus is sort of complaining. He says, you know, you guys are in error because you do not know the scriptures nor the power of God. And I love this verse because it shows us the weakness of just looking at or the weakness of just looking along and the importance of both together. That when I have the scripture as revelation, that can put light in my darkness and cure my blindness, or at least help me correct my blindness. But at the same time, it's not about just looking at God. It's about an experience of intimacy with God. It's about knowing God. And if I'll only spend my life simply knowing facts about God, I have totally missed the point of living a life with the God of the universe. You've been very, very patient. Forgive my forbearance. Thank you so much for letting me be with you guys this morning. It's been a pleasure. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Duffy. Just a few things to end with. I will say that I'm happy to say that Frank Zappa and the Mothers are not on any of my playlists. And this is basic Issachar thinking, that we should always consider first what we should do rather than explore the cans. Before we explore the cans, we can explore the cans, what we can do, but definitely know what we should do first. If you are not staying for the youth ministry, youth pastor luncheon, if you haven't registered, and if you're not registered for the men's event, please drop off your lanyard at the desk on the way out. Let's give another big hand to Duffy. Thank you very much, Duff. Thank you very much. Let's pray to close. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this opportunity. And as I often pray, I pray that the things that we've heard today, the things that are true, would take deep root in our hearts and renew our minds. And the things that aren't, we would forget. But I pray, Lord, that we would also follow through and have courage to follow through with the things that we've learned and put them into action and practice so that you would be glorified and that we would know you better. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for coming out. Have a great day.